It's really difficult to answer that because, well, not difficult to answer it. We all know what the answer is, but it's really difficult to understand it. Because when you talk to politicians on a one-on-one, especially the younger guys, they're like, oh, we are with you. We have many friends who are gay. What is the problem? But we cannot take a stand that is against the party line. For some reason, most politicians think that this is one area that they have the backing of their constituencies. And part of the problem, I think, is that as the Supreme Court, as one of the Supreme Court judges said, there are hardly any of them. And I think that's what the politicians are thinking. I don't know. I'm just imagining what they're thinking. But I do know there is, because we still do a lot of one-on-one meeting politicians across party lines at the smallest of opportunities. We do not let go. So this is the response we're getting. So I think this is why I talk about larger coalitions. This is why I want other movements to start talking about LGBT issues. And this whole issue of transgenders, the Supreme Court giving us a very good transgender judgment, because most Indian men do think, they do accept transgenders much more easily than they do the rest of the community. Because you talk to most men, they'll say, but they're women, aren't they? The same Supreme Court judgment. I just got a call from one of the, from the Delhi, from someone in the Delhi government saying, can I be part of a committee to now try and figure out who a transgender is? Because they don't know how, because nowhere in the judgment have they defined transgender. So I said, listen, I don't want to be on this committee, because if I tell you I'm transgender, on what basis are you going to say I'm not? Right? What are the indicators? And most transgenders, so their worry is that if they get all the benefits from OBC and all of that, we have to stop that. So we have a problem even with the transgender judgment. But believe me, most people that I know accept someone who's transgender, and they equate transgender with hijras, who, by the way, the term is now being used interchangeably. So you have hijras saying we are transgenders when they want to say it, or they'll say we are hijras when they want to say it. So is someone trans someone who's post-operative or in the process of getting an operation? Or is it those millions of guys or women who cannot afford an operation and consider themselves to be trans? Or is it the visible hijra identity which is trans? So there's a lot of confusion right now thanks to the Supreme Court judgment. So no one knows what's happening, by the way. So now we are being asked to figure out who is a trans person. So we are actually in deep trouble at this point.
Just to respond to the 3 points which you made. The first was, if the union government didn't sort of appeal the judgment of the Delhi High Court, then where was the question of the Supreme Court even considering it? I think that's a very valid point. In the United States, in the Supreme Court, for example, they would have just tossed out these appeals because the person who came before the Indian Supreme Court had no standing. There was a criminal law. The criminal law was interpreted in a particular manner by the Delhi High Court. If government thought it wrong, then they could have used the legislative route and corrected the judgment by bringing in an explanation or whatever they wanted. Having accepted the judgment, and the government in court having said that we accept the Delhi High Court judgment, the matter ought to have ended there. But the Supreme Court sort of, lowered that standing barrier and went on to hear the case. As far as a legislative response is concerned, that's very possible, because as far as provision like 377 is concerned, it's on what we call, we are a federal system, so we have legislatures at the union government level, which is parliament, as well as state legislatures. So you can, now the authority of the states and parliament is divided under the constitution. There are some subjects which are exclusively with parliament, some exclusively with the state, and then we have a list of subjects which are called concurrent list. And on those, the subjects enumerated in the concurrent list, Both Parliament as well as the state legislatures have jurisdiction or have authority to pass a law. So you have, 377 is one of those. So what it means is, in practical terms, if you're able to persuade even one state government to repeal this law or to reintroduce or reword this particular provision, it would be a big step and a big relief to the citizenry within that particular territory of that state. So that is certainly an angle and an avenue which is being explored by persons who are working in the field. The third point is, at the end of the day, this is an Indian Supreme Court judgment. And I think it's an atrocious judgment. And it shouldn't be on the law reports. So it's time the Supreme Court corrected itself. And it's most important for our citizenry and our people, but it's actually very, very important for the world as well. Because the Indian Supreme Court is a greatly respected institution the world over. It's regarded as a leading institution. And unless the Supreme Court of India corrects itself, I can see a lot of other courts elsewhere in the world not being, sufficiently enthused to take the bold step which the Delhi High Court had earlier taken. So I think that's important. I think we should correct this in some manner through the court system as well, but the legislative option remains.
So I have one question I'm going to throw out, and it's always puzzled me, right? So you have two different decisions happening at the same time. So basically, you have transgender folk who have every other avenue open to them except sex, right? So that, to me, there was like a profound paradox that you could only be transgender as long as you didn't perform unnatural acts, which by being transgender, you're automatically going to perform, right? So.
Part of it is because we are thinking of transgenders and hijras in the same context. And according to hijra traditions, according to what they say and not what they do, right? According to hijra traditions, once you become a hijra, you never have sex. That is, if you are a nirvan hijra, that is a castrated hijra, you never have sex. Therefore, you don't see them as being sexual in any way. That's the confusion. And that's why we say 377 and the transgender judgment don't go hand in hand.
Except they do, because the transgender judgment is as sex-phobic as the other one.
Yes,
but
yes,
just
yes.
that people don't have sex, so they're fine with that.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So 377 is a stumbling block
Yes.
because people actually have sex.
Absolutely.
Let that be a lesson to all of you.
I think the role the media plays is critical, right? How they talk about these issues. Having a sensitive film like Aligarh come out, that film was tremendous, right? I'm sure it's going to make a difference. But even working with the media, one thing we've realized is that is a constant battle. It's not as easy as it seems. I remember there was this whole situation where a gay man and his partner were murdered. And this happened post a party that was given by another gay man. And the way the media went to town over it, because this person who was murdered was from the UN system, it was really frightening what was happening. And then you see a huge difference between the language, the way the media report these issues in different languages as opposed to the English media. So there's a whole lot of problems there. And we've been doing a lot of work with, we meaning a lot of us who have been working on these issues have been working with the media for years now. And the one place where we've seen some change is in the English media. But the Hindi and the Tamil and the Urdu newspapers, Punjabi, we've not been able to accomplish that at all. So clearly a movie like Aligarh, I think, is going to make a difference. But sometimes I feel very often we are speaking to the converted. There are many people who will not go and see a film like Aligarh because from what they've heard, what the film is about. So, and it'll be all of us going to see Aligarh because we really think it's great that a film like this has come out. But every little step helps, I feel. Yeah.
Actually, I started doing HIV/AIDS work pretty contiguously with HIV/AIDS discovery. I was working in prisons, American prisons. And we went in to do education, and then all the equipment, I mean, like, everything you went in to sort of show people how they could have safe sex had to be taken out. Every condom was counted, right? I spent years in the state of Iowa with every sixth child disappearing and going to another state to get electroshock therapy treatment and ending up on the streets of San Francisco selling sex. And these were adolescents. This was everything from 7-year-olds to 18-year-olds. And what was interesting is the American media has been complicated, but the thing that really helped in Iowa was PFLAG, parents and friends of lesbians and gays. And so I think basically the education's got to be done on the ground. And it's got to be done by people who you recognize, right? So if somebody, like one of my, Anjali Gopalan, her mom, half her family is Shiv Sena. They live in Mumbai. And it's really interesting, her mom's doing sort of little conversations on the ground and actually changing the way in which people talk in Marathi about what it means to be out, right? She comes with a partner, the mom introduces her as a partner. Any film made in Bombay is not going to do half the work that somebody who lives in Marathi and actually comes from a Shiv Sena family is going to be able to do. So I think, you're right, that the media matters and the media is complicated. But, I think that's what you talked about at the beginning, was that the everydayness and the way in which people actually talk in an everyday way.
Absolutely, but I really want to tell you, even straight people who kiss on the streets of Delhi get into trouble because there are different nuisance laws in every city, okay? And you're right, the issue is, do we see it as an issue of right? Or are we seeing it as something we're doing out of the goodness of our heart for somebody? And this has been an issue around many movements. And the problem I find very often is that when we, and this is especially true of NGO types like us, right? I have this constant debate with colleagues of mine that we never put the individual we never see it as a question of rights. For example, if I'm taking care of children, I see it as something I'm doing because those poor kids need the help, they're orphans, they're HIV positive, and I don't see it as the right of that child to get everything, to get the best care available or the best care possible, because our whole thinking always comes from charity. It never comes from the rights perspective. So unless we make that change, and this is true for human beings or animals, because I do a lot of work with animals today, and I'll tell you something, that it is the same way that we look at children, animals, male child versus the female child. It's the same discourse in both. So unless we put that individual as the right of that individual, you put them in the discourse and look at them from looking at them only from the issue of rights, only then are you going to make this change. Otherwise, we're going to continue in this haphazard manner.
I also just want to add, I thought that was an excellent question, and I think Geeta was picking up on this as well, that one of the criticisms about, again, the case against 377 and 377 is that they both acquiesce to a certain kind of privatization of sex. If you do it in private, it's all right, but suddenly if you do it in public, it becomes awful. And so there is this sort of neoliberal, globalized, capitalistic privatization of sex, that you do it somewhere else so we don't have to see it. And which goes back to our discussion about the phobia around sex in relation to both the transgender judgment and 377. So I thought that was a really excellent question.
Look, the 377 on the face of it, when you read it, it's sort of at a certain level gender neutral. At a certain level, it doesn't get into the details as to who is committing the offense. Essentially, it's, if there are two persons who are engaged in unnatural activity, as understood in this very, very traditional and confined manner, then both of them are guilty as far as but who's going to give you the evidence? So at a practical level, you are not likely to have very much of a prosecution, a successful prosecution in a situation like that, unless there is a falling out between the two persons who are engaged in this particular activity. Then you will have one person who's a complainant. And when you have one person who's the complainant, then that person is obviously not going to say that I am engaged in the criminal activity. Person will point a finger at the other and say that this person engaged in activity which was of a criminal nature, or I was forced to enter into the activity, etc. But it's also used, to blackmail. And there's a whole myriad circumstances where it can be used. But I think the case in the Supreme Court is not with regard to individual abuses, but it's on a much, much larger plane to whether you should have a statute such as this, which criminalizes a significant segment of the population. There are studies which show that you have, I'll use the expression, sort of a non-majority sexual orientation remains constant in society, but it ranges between 5 to 7%. There are a number of studies. It never goes beyond 7%. There's no fear that everyone's going to suddenly, move across or something the spectrum. But it's a stable percentage within any general population. And then this is the science and understanding at the moment. It may change over a period of time as well. There's a much greater degree of fluidity in understanding aspects of gender and sexuality than what informed us, say, 3 or 4 decades ago, when it was much more rigid. But now there's a much greater fluidity, and that fluidity and understanding has to somehow permeate through the media, through courses, etc., to decision makers, to the larger, through the social sector, etc., through communities and societies in general. Just to respond very briefly, see, the Constitution is, under our system, the Constitution is the highest law. And the Constitution is designed to protect minorities. Okay, you didn't need a Constitution if everything was, then you just have a democracy and then you have a vote, and then that's the majoritarian argument. But because there are minorities and because our recognition of minorities changes over time, it's very important for the Constitution as an organic document to be interpreted with changing times, to accept and recognize new elements within your society who are in need of protection. That's one. And number two, the point over here is you can't criminalize someone for being who he or she is. That's what 377 does if you interpret it in the manner. It doesn't say you don't have to do anything at all. You have to just be yourself. And you have to be yourself and lead a life along your sexual orientation, which is something which science tells us may happen at a stage when you are in your childhood, when you're not even making decisions, when in law you're not even fully formed. Because there's a fiction in law that after you attain the age of majority, and that sort of varies for different laws that when you attain majority, you can then take a decision for yourself, and before that you can't, right? This particular orientation develops at a point of time before you are even an adult as recognized under Indian law. So, to me, that's the offensive part of this provision, and that is why it requires an interpretation which makes it, consonant with constitutional values.
So, I want you to think carefully about the word natural, right? Because that was part of what I was trying to do. So if we go back to the question of age of consent, the idea of age of consent, which was also produced. And go back to, let's talk about the US. You have a different natural adulthood based when you can drink, a different natural adulthood, different age when you turn into an adult when you can vote, a different age when you turn into an adult when you can buy a gun, right? So what I'm trying to get you to, what I was trying to do is to make you understand that there's nothing natural about the idea of natural, right? That natural itself, the idea of naturalness itself, is profoundly unnatural. It came about as a sort of bizarre confluence of the law and science and came to inhabit our everyday sense of self, right? So it became naturalized. I mean, the way, as a citizen, you're naturalized. So it's interesting. So if you raise the question, so it's not mirroring. It's actually, that's why Altaf Hussein Hali, he understood that once something was punishable by law, something that was ordinary, many, many different ways of being queer, writing about gay men, women, I mean, lots of stuff in poetry. There were many different registers of desire in many different ways, writing, having, doing, whatever, right? The only thing that was constructed was heterosexuality because you married and it had nothing to do with what you did in bed, right? So we actually came to accept the idea of naturalness over time. And so the thing is, how do you let go of it? I mean, every time we talk, we act as though the idea of natural has always been in place, that our understanding of natural has already been in place. So I'm asking you, it'd be interesting to go back and think, okay, it's a fiction. It's a fiction that we believe desperately, right? And with that fiction comes unnatural, right? So what does the fiction, what if we let go of the fiction? I mean, this is the question you were asking. I mean, in law, we can't, in some ways. In constitutional law, you don't, yeah. Yeah.
And could I just add to that? It's really interesting. When you look at how this is written up, if you have carnal intercourse against the order of nature with man, woman, or animal, okay? So all of us in this room, with the exception of animal maybe, but most of us who are having sex are actually having sex against the order of nature. It's a very Judeo-Christian term and notion, right? So if you are not, if you are having sex for anything other than procreation, yeah, right? So then you're actually going against the order of nature. So I think all of us would be in the dock with this one.
So I want to add, actually the only way you know that you're doing something natural and not unnatural is if you get a really good picture showing you what to do, which I'm feeling most of us in the room have not seen.
No, we don't have any census data, but let me tell you, I know that for whenever even in the HIV/AIDS scenario, NACO, when it's asked those questions, are you homosexual? The answer we got most of the time was no. No. Because people don't necessarily, are you gay? They don't necessarily have these identities, right? So it's really difficult. Now, a lot of men in our culture who could be having sex with men are also married to women. So they definitely don't see themselves as being gay or homosexual. So it's really difficult to get that kind of data, and that's skewed data even for us in the data that NACO gives out. So NACO actually gives us data which says we have X number of homosexual men, because we only talk about men. Women don't exist in any of this, right? And definitely not in the HIV debate. But no one ever talks about women. But even the data we have on who are seen as homosexual men is very skewed because most men are not saying. So it's the way you ask the question. If you ask, are you homosexual? No. Are you gay? No. Are you sleeping with men? Yes. So we are getting very skewed data.
See, there's a lot of conduct which you might consider natural, which society at large feels is not appropriate. I mean, you may come and sock me because you didn't like the talk or whatever. But society will say that amounts to battery, the law will allow me to sue you and get damages from you, and the criminal law will allow me to make a complaint to the police station, and if I'm able to establish it, you might serve a jail term. So it may be your natural response, but it's not everything which you want to do naturally which is kosher. Okay, so there is that distinction. So there are several things which a person may want to do, which a person does, which may exist in society, but society, through the law-making process, says so much and no more. We will criminalize this conduct. We don't approve of this. We want society's conduct to change.
Incest being one.
Yeah. Answering the other question, just also very briefly. See, the point over here, as far as it is criminal, you're going to have a whole bunch of quacks and doctors and other mendicants with, all sorts of solutions. I mean, that's their business. So it's not. So you have certain provisions like, magic remedies, Prohibition Act, and things like that, where you could probably proceed against this sort of a thing. But by and large, as far as medical science is concerned, there was a period of time when it was regarded as not just unnatural, but curable through these various methods. But as science develops, we're coming to now a stage when people realize that this is, natural, normal, acceptable behavior, which is practiced by a certain segment of society, and it is entitled to, those persons are entitled to that space. So I think the point's well taken. Maybe we should go after these persons with, these so-called cures, etc. But the real action probably and energies ought to be devoted possibly elsewhere.
I want to actually think about the question of cures, and one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that, and this comes back to Michel Foucault, that in fact, in some ways, more conversation about homosexuality is likely to produce more doctors pretending to cure it. So ironically, the kinds of things that are also maybe helping folk deal with it, right? Media, media visibility, whatever, is also liable to produce lots more quacks. And the thing, I wanted to actually go back to the natural, unnatural, because that's why I started with Altaf Hussain Hali, right? Exactly his paradox, right? Something that happened that was just ordinary, that was every day on the streets of Delhi. Delhi was full of laundas, and poetry was full of laundas, and suddenly it became against nature.
Good point. For example, someone like Sarmad. A lot of the Sufi saints, and how does Sarmad get killed? He basically finally becomes, he takes off all his clothes. Aurangzeb gets his chance to say, and he says, nothing should come between me and my God. And Aurangzeb gets the chance and beheads him, right? So how are we seeing unnatural and natural? It depends on who's in power, how they want to interpret it, how they want to take advantage of it. All of this is there. So unfortunate, but it's something that we are still following the same thing. I mean, we still talk about natural and unnatural all the time. And we can't get rid of these terms. It's really difficult to get rid of these terms, as someone had said. We should take it out, but very hard.
I'm afraid I know I can see several hands up, and I'm afraid we have to stop because it's past 6:30. The good news is that the three of them are going to be captive for a few more minutes, so if you can mob them and ambush them, you can ask your questions anyway. But right now, I just want to say that one of the mandates for the ISHQ series, as the title itself suggests, was that we talk about issues that entail discussions of history, society, and queerness. And I think the discussion about Section 377 did all that and more, because it certainly suggested not just a mutual imbrication of all these three issues, but also suggests that each of these issues has tentacles in so many different directions that we can think about this forever, not in a sentimentalized version, but really with analytical rigor, which is what I hope this conversation has inspired in all of us. So please join me in thanking our speakers for today.